Hi, I'm an old guy who watches Doctor Who, and I have for a very long time. And this is a ranking of the companions of the First Doctor, which, as always, is really an excuse to examine those companions. There were 8 of them, plus 3 failed companions. All First Doctor companions fell into one of 3 categories. There was the damsel in distress. She existed to be rescued and taught. Most of the time, she was a teenager. This was laid out by Sidney Newman, the head of drama at the BBC and the father of Doctor Who. He wanted a kid who would get into trouble each week. Then there was the He-Man, the male role model. He was the action hero, running, jumping, and fighting, and protecting the damsel. He was also the moral center of the show. The Doctor was not to be trusted. It was the He-Man that took the moral high ground. This also made him argumentative and at times stubborn. He could be slow in accepting new or strange situations. The third category I'll call the mother, since initially her job was to be motherly to the damsel. And she was also paired with the He-Man, so her relationships were strongest with other companions, not the Doctor. Additionally, she was more open to the unusual, so she could calm the He-Man and get him to accept what was happening. Before ranking who did it best, I want to put each companion into their place in time. The show started with 3 companions: Susan Foreman, the Doctor's granddaughter, and a teen damsel, played by Carol Ann Ford. Ian Chesterton, Susan's science teacher and the He-Man, portrayed by William Russell. And Barbara Wright, the mother and Susan's history teacher, played by Jacqueline Hill. Ian and Barbara became companions by following Susan home because they found her weird, which we are not supposed to consider wildly inappropriate, though the Doctor does, who kidnaps them without any way of returning them home to stop them from going to the police. Of course, he could have just left without them, in which case the police wouldn't matter. But the Doctor is rather shifty at this point, so that fits. This TARDIS team would stay together for 10 stories, consisting of 51 episodes, before Carol Ann Ford would quit, tired of playing the damsel. So Susan was left behind to marry a man in the ruins of future London. The very next show she would be replaced by Vicki, played by Maureen O'Brien, taking on Susan's role as teen damsel, and as a surrogate granddaughter for the Doctor. She was an orphan from the future, so really taking on all of Susan's roles. This group would last 6 stories in Season 2, 26 episodes, until Russell and Hill decided not to renew their contracts, thus having Ian and Barbara return home in a Dalek time machine, empty of Daleks, since the Doctor was unable to fly the TARDIS accurately. Ian was immediately replaced by astronaut Stephen Taylor as the He-Man, played by Peter Purves. He's introduced in the same story we lose Ian. Barbara was not replaced, so there was no mother role, for now. And then things got messy, which can be laid at the feet of new producer, call him showrunner, more or less in modern terminology, John Wiles, who had a difficult relationship with all of the stars, and the BBC higher-ups. He didn't like O'Brien complaining about poor scripts, so dumped her 2 stories into the 3rd season, marrying off Vicki to a Trojan in The Mythmakers. His plan was to replace her with a new damsel, Katerina, a Trojan handmaid, played by Adrian Hill and introduced in that same story. After the script was written and the part cast, Wiles decided his writers couldn't manage a companion from the past who wouldn't know what a light bulb was, so killed her off early in the very next story, The Daleks' Master Plan. Our first failed companion, being only a minor character in The Mythmakers and making it only a third of the way through The Daleks' Master Plan. I think good writers could have done amazing things with Katerina, but perhaps Wiles knew the quality of his writers better than I. His next plan was to take Sarah Kingdom, a security officer already written into the Daleks' Master Plan, and make her the new companion, which would have been a big change, as she was not a damsel. How far this plan progressed is uncertain, but not far. There's 2 accounts on why this failed. Either actress Jean Marsh turned down the offer, or writer Terry Nation stopped it. Nation's contract had a clause stating that anything he invented, such as the Daleks, or anyone, such as Sarah Kingdom, belonged to him, not the BBC, and he intended to create a spin-off show for the Daleks with Kingdom as a character. How that failed deserves its own video. For her part, Jean Marsh doesn't recall being offered an extended role in either Doctor Who or the spin-off, and she wouldn't have been interested, as she had lots of work, including creating Upstairs Downstairs a few years later. Whatever the case, the character died before the end of the story, and you should be getting a glimpse of Wiles's organizational skills. His third plan was for another damsel companion, Anne Chaplet, or Chaplet, introduced in the next story, The Massacre, a tale of 16th century France, and again had the script written and actress hired before he realized that the 16th century was in the past, and his writers couldn't deal with that, and thus our third failed companion in a row. You'll often see Katerina and Sarah Kingdom listed as companions, but if they count, so do dozens of others, pretty much anyone who ever allies with the Doctor. However, Anne is rarely listed as a companion, even though she was far closer, with her name appearing on original copies of future scripts. In the end, Wiles chose as the new teen damsel companion Dodo Chaplet, an assumed descendant of Anne, played by Jackie Lane, having her just randomly enter the TARDIS. I'll get back to that later. This TARDIS team of the Doctor, Stephen, and Dodo didn't last long, nor did John Wiles, which shouldn't surprise anyone. New producer Innes Lloyd had no interest in Dodo, nor Stephen. He wanted a swingin' 60s vibe, so Stephen was gone in 4 stories and Dodo in 5, both being replaced, kinda, by Ben and Polly, played by Michael Craze and Annika Wills, in the 5th story, The War Machines. Ben was a typical He-Man type. Polly was a cross between the damsel and the mother archetypes, and was a 20-something, not a teen. She did some screaming and was in need of rescue, but a little less. There was no one for her to mother, but she was decidedly paired with the He-Man instead of the Doctor, and she took on the mother's empathic and open traits, accepting strange new things, and calming Ben. And so ends the first Doctor's run, with Ben and Polly continuing on to the second Doctor. Alright, so how good are these different companions? How well did they fulfill their functions, if you want them to be doing that? I'm not ranking the 3 failed companions because they're failed companions, not companions. So, starting with the least, number 8, Dodo Chaplet. Yeah, she was destined for last. She was the 3rd teen damsel in a row, a replacement for a replacement. So we've seen it all before. Even if she had been great in the role, she'd be lesser for being 3rd. But she wasn't great. She needed to bring something new, and she had nothing. She might have had something new, as she was meant to have a northern accent, but the BBC put out a memo saying all characters in BBC shows had to speak with received pronunciation. Didn't want any of those lower-class characters around.
I think myself and Sylvester McCoy, the rest, they may have been from regional backgrounds, but they used RP, which is a dialect which is associated with the ruling class.
So Dodo appeared with one accent, spoke with received pronunciation the next episode, spoke with a different accent the following episode, before returning to received pronunciation for good. Innes Lloyd said he didn't want her because actress Jackie Lane looked too old on camera. That's not false, but it's a bit harsh. It's not like any of the other 20-somethings who played the teen damsels looked like teenagers either. As for personality or background, she was a 60s girl, and that's it. She had the second worst introduction of all time, only after Mel, and the worst departure. They'd done all the initial character work on Anne, so Dodo got nothing. She's just some girl in the street who wants to call the police, so steps into the TARDIS thinking it's a police call box. Stephen then says the police are near, so the Doctor takes off, instead of locking the door. And so Dodo is stuck with him. She immediately says she's fine with it, and that's it. About as much effort was put into her departure. Less than halfway through her final story, she's taken to the country to get 48 hours rest. And that's it. We never see her again. Ben and Polly, replacing her, show up to say,
she's feeling much better, and she'd like to stay here in London, and she sent you her love.
Done. It's a fitting end. Number 7. Ben Jackson. He has many of the same issues as Dodo. He's a replacement of a replacement, and everything interesting for the He-Man had been done, and he simply brought nothing new to the role. He might have, as a representative of the youth culture of the 60s, but this was the BBC, so radicalism wasn't allowed. To fit the He-Man mold, he was made a sailor, because nothing says edgy like the Royal Navy. And he had bigger problems, as the archetype just didn't work anymore. The show had changed, with the Doctor now being the moral center, leaving little for the He-Man to do besides a few action beats. At this point in the show, arguing with the Doctor made him look like an ass, and denying what was in front of his face, after the viewers have seen it all for 3 years, made him look stupid. And just wanting to get back to his ship doesn't make him likable, particularly as we've already had companions who wanted to get home. The performance doesn't help as Craze tends to yell his lines.
Well, it looks like South America, but it can't be though.
Which only makes Ben more abrasive. Number 6. Susan Foreman. If you don't know the old show, this might be surprising, but for those of you who do, her placement is predictable. The first episode of Doctor Who was titled An Unearthly Child, meaning her. But after that, she was a very earthly child, in all the worst ways. Carol Ann Ford quit for a reason. She'd been lied to get her to take the part, a job she accepted so she wouldn't have to play a damsel in distress. They told her she would be proactive, fight, and have alien powers. Except for being telepathic in one story, none of it was true. Susan got into trouble, screamed, and fell down. Rinse and repeat. Worse, she cried. Susan was miserable, and an unhappy companion is not fun to watch. She didn't even have a particularly nice relationship with her grandfather. She was supposed to be 16, though she was written more like a 13-year-old, and treated like a young child. The spanked bottom line in the New Who Christmas special Twice Upon a Time was originally said by the Doctor to Susan. And I have to mention her departure, as it's generally taken as a nice moment. It's not. The Doctor's speech is good, but only out of context. Those making the show thought that if they were getting rid of a female character, the way to do that was to hand her from one male protector to another. Yeah. So, from a grandfather to a husband. And that husband would be somebody just introduced in that story. This is an unfortunate trope the classic show would use many times. So the Doctor locks Susan out of the TARDIS, forcing her to marry this guy she just met and live in a post-apocalyptic London. Yes, that's what she wanted to do, but she doesn't get to choose it. Also, she's 16. At the very least, he could have stuck around a while, even a few days, a week. Make sure that marrying off this teenager to a rebel fighter is actually a good idea. But nope, he locks her out, says a nice speech, and is gone. Number 5. Stephen Taylor. Once again, we have a companion who is obviously a replacement for another companion, just this year's model, though with fewer extras. As the show was changing, there was less for the He-Man to do, though the moral center is still in the middle of shifting to the Doctor, so Stephen has legit reasons to argue with him. Though that doesn't explain why the writers and script editor decided to increase the arguing between the He-Man and the Doctor, and that gets tiring. The show starts to feel bleak, lots of depression, and quarreling. Stephen is basically unhappy Ian, but without the authority, purpose, or warmth. He does the job. His backstory defined him as an astronaut from the future, but that was mostly ignored. He's written as just another human from the 60s. During the first Doctor's run, they had real problems representing anyone as alien or from the future. His exit feels abrupt, because it was. After the Doctor breaks the class system of a troubling alien world, it's suddenly suggested that Stephen would be the perfect person to act as mediator, and basically run the place. That doesn't seem natural, but rather just a quick way to toss away a companion, since male companions didn't have the default method of marrying someone they just met. Number 4. Polly. No last name for Polly, even though Ben got one. Behind the scenes, she was Polly Wright, but as Wright was Barbara's last name, they just never used it on screen. Polly's sharp, and depending on the script, takes action, and repeatedly is the one to figure out what's going on and how to defeat the enemy. And her youthful, but not childish vibe was a nice change of pace. She had the potential to be a great companion, likely the best of the first Doctor, but scripts let her down. Though keep in mind, only one of her 3 serials with the First Doctor is intact. The others are completely or partially missing. So with so little to go by, my thoughts on Polly may be influenced by her time with the Second Doctor, which is mostly incomplete as well. Anyway, without a dedicated Damsel, the writers didn't know what to do, so assigned the screaming to Polly, even though it didn't fit her. She was inconsistent. One moment thoughtful and new, the next generic. She was best when interacting directly with the Doctor instead of with Ben. She would occasionally act as a caregiver for him, which made for a nice relationship. Number 3. Vicki. I'm not a fan of having a damsel in distress, and certainly not a teen one, but if they thought the show needed that, this is a good version. Like Susan, Vicki's futuristic background rarely comes into play, though occasionally she will mention some knowledge she has that Ian and Barbara lack. Mostly, she's written as what adult men think a teenage girl is like. But unlike Susan, Vicki is having a good time. She's joyful. And while she's here for the requisite screaming, she's not one to lose it entirely. She doesn't seem on the verge of a nervous breakdown or crying all the time like her predecessor. She has a bit of a backbone, which is nice in a damsel. And her relationship with the Doctor, as a surrogate granddaughter, is what Susan's should have been, close and caring. She doesn't end well. We have our second case of a female companion's exit being marrying her off to some guy she just met in a horribly inappropriate location. Yeah, this future girl is going to have a great time in the ancient lands around fallen Troy. But while she was there, the show functioned better than with the other teen damsels. Number 2. Ian Chesterton. And Number 1. Barbara Wright. Ian and Barbara are a pair, so I'm giving a slight nod to Barbara, but it's best to talk about them together. They are a team, much more with each other than with the Doctor, and when not in conflict with monsters or barbarians, they give off big mom and dad energy. These are the parents. Not the cool parents, but the loving ones. They are authority figures, and can pull that off without being annoying. And as the show was still doing the edutainment thing during their run, they would teach. Yes, in-world, but really they were teaching the children at home, which did give them an additional thing to do that later companions lacked. Ian was the hero. He was brave, strong, thoughtful, principled, and kind. Also perhaps a bit too involved and a bit too righteous. And he might be a little too skilled physically for the character to make sense. He's a science teacher. I wonder when he had the time to pick up medieval weapon training, pressure points, wrestling, you name it. Ian could do it. He also got hit on the head a lot. Well, William Russell's previous role had been in The Adventures of Sir Lancelot, so knight in shining armor was what he was known for. Barbara is easily the strongest female companion in the First Doctor's run, and beyond. She didn't take any guff from anyone, particularly the Doctor. She has a bit too many damsel moments, but that's just a given in the classic show with most any female companion. She has the best companion-focused episode of The 8 Companions with The Aztecs, an episode that influenced many others in the new era. And I'm just ignoring that Barbara shot Vicki's space dog. That's a bit of bad writing that just doesn't make sense either for the character of Barbara or for the show. Ian and Barbara get more development than any of these other companions, and not only is their introduction more detailed, they get the best exit of this batch, choosing to leave, to go home, which was always their plan, and they even get some celebration time in. Overall, the First Doctor's companions are not my favorite group. Not my least favorite, but on average, lower. Certainly in part due to those rigid roles. The roles, and purpose of the companion, would loosen and change throughout the classic run. There would still be damsels, too many damsels, but it would no longer be a constant, and he-men and mothers would be even less common. And that's the companions of the First Doctor. And I'm enjoying these videos looking back at Doctor Who, so I'll do it some more. If you like me doing it, please like and subscribe, because that's how YouTube works.